Hello, everyone. So today's talk is one of my favourite titles, What's All This Bilge About Noises and Hauntings and Footsteps in the Dark? Which is a quote from the book, as you might know. I'm going to be talking about Gothic terror and Gothic parody in Georgette Hirst's Footsteps in the Dark. If you are interested in this content, you want to chat to me about it, or you would like me to give you some access to some of the articles or edited collection chapters that I've already written about this topic, you can contact me through the University of Nottingham, where I currently work, and that's my email on screen. You can also find me on Twitter or Blue Sky at romgothsam. So do feel free to get in touch if this is a topic that's of interest to you. I'm always excited to hear people's opinions and the work that they're doing on it as well. So let's get cracking. I will just note, by the way, that some of these pictures have the name Jennifer Cloister in, and you should definitely check out Jennifer Cloister's work and Jennifer Cloister's blog. She is an amazing hair scholar, but she's also a collector of different editions, and she has some of the best editions, which I wanted you to be able to see, but do go out and check out that blog of hers. So, Georgette Hare, most of you will know her as a romance writer, and specifically a historical romance writer, writing particularly in the Georgian and Regency periods. But she also, of course, published in a number of genres, including sort of straight historical fiction, contemporary novels, and contemporary detective fiction. But as Crawford notes, this isn't all she does. Her genres are not always completely distinct, and in fact, detectives and crime feature across all of her romance work as well. Not in every single novel, but in texts like The Reluctant Widow, where you have a smuggling subplot, or The Tollgate, where you have a theft and murder subplot. So crime and detectives are a sort of consistent feature. In terms of mystery novels, sort of that are focused on mystery specifically, there are 12 written between 1932 and 1953. As Bargenia notes, there are 10 of these that are sort of in the classical mode, what Banda describes as what fun mysteries, in which criminal investigation is an amusing pastime, and an ounce of cynical wit is worth a pound of trite moralizing. But that description is singularly an apposite to two of these novels, and I've put them in bold. You can see them: Footsteps in the Dark, her first mystery, and Penhallow from 1942, which we'll be reading in our book group this week. So if anybody is interested in coming to the book group, if you're in time, do get in touch with me with the details that you could see at the beginning, and I can send you an invite to that. So these two texts are far darker thematically than this what fun kind of mystery. And they are darker thematically and stylistically, and deeply engaged with the Gothic mode. This particular talk is going to focus on her first thriller, Footsteps in the Dark, because I didn't have time to do both of them in detail. And I'm going to use it to articulate Hare's production of a distinctive comic Gothic, alternately terrifying and farcical, which mixes Gothic terror and Gothic parody. So thinking about Footsteps in the Dark, there's fairly little critical literature about it, and what there is tends to be pretty dismissive. So Nancy Wingate's criticism is an example of this. She writes about Footsteps in the Dark only in a footnote. She makes clear that she hasn't read it herself, and she describes it as simply a rather awkward first attempt. This is based only on hearsay. So it's an extreme but not unrepresentative example of how people talk about this novel. Her herself referred to Footsteps as not up to much, and she actually suppressed the novel, informing Heinemann's publishers Louis Callender that it should be buried in decent oblivion, leaving it difficult to access until its American reprinting in 1985. So critics like Devlin, for example, in 1984, wouldn't have had access, or would find it very difficult to have access to the text, as Devlin views it as never reprinted until this point. When it was released to a lukewarm reception, with reviewer TJ Bingen dismissing it as fun, but indescribably ridiculous. And Shibbock, a bit kind of warmer, but still very tepid, saying this is not a major rediscovery, but it's a pleasant minor work. However, I'm going to argue that although it's not one of her most polished works, and although she never wrote another detective in the same exact vein, Footsteps is still key for investigating and understanding the comic Gothic strategies across Hare's work. I've just popped this in as a little bit of fun information for you guys. The title actually comes from a haunting that Hare experienced, or the ghostly footsteps that she heard in their house in Kratovo when they lived there. So there's a very kind of Gothic link straight away, even from the title. Before we begin an analysis of the novel, it's probably worth briefly reviewing the plot, as I know a lot of you haven't read it. All of these different covers give you kind of different clues to the content, the time of the setting, different aspects of the plot. But I'm going to give you a sort of overview here, and you can spot the elements, spot the elements as we go. So in the plot, there are three siblings, Peter, Margaret, and Celia, and there's Celia's husband, Charles, and their aunt, Bothanquette. And they're on holiday in a country house that they've just inherited, which was once a priory. The house is haunted by tales of a spectral monk, but the majority of the party are unconvinced about this rumour. They presume that the haunting is a cover for criminal activity, and Charles declares that no ghost or pseudo-ghost is going to frighten me out of this place. And the group decide to unravel the mystery, dismissing all of the ghostly rumours as, my favourite phrase, ghost twaddle. So over the course of the novel, they encounter a range of suspicious characters, as you might expect. So from an eccentric moth hunter to a drug-addicted French artist. And they undergo a number of seemingly supernatural experiences, including multiple apparitions of the monk and a partially successful seance. The story ends when Margaret and Peter, the siblings, accidentally find a secret passage in the library and are kidnapped by the monk, who is unmasked, spoiler alert, as the only character who has not come under suspicion, Colonel Ackley. He is revealed as a murderer, having disposed of the French artist Duval, and he's also revealed to be the ruthless leader of a gang of forgers, colluding with Wilkes, who is the seemingly jolly landlord of the local Bell Inn. As you can tell, even this brief outline suggests the Gothic roots of the text, as does the title. In suggesting that this is Gothic, I'm not suggesting that this is the only Gothic crime fiction, of course not. It's one in a long line of texts which demonstrate the interrelation of the Gothic and crime fiction. As C.F. McIntyre said in 1920, crime fiction finds its roots in the early Gothic and owes much to Mrs. Radcliffe, Anne Radcliffe, and her curious heroines. We actually find a range of similar investigative figures across the early Gothic, many of them recognisable as quasi-detectives. So in Eliza Parton's Castle of Wolfenbach, for example, the heroine Matilda is not fooled into a belief of supernatural agency. Instead, quote, she conceived there must be some mystery which she resolved, if possible, to explore, end quote. In William Godwin's Caleb Williams, the picture that you can see on screen there of a man having a pistol held to his head, in Caleb Williams, the protagonist, Caleb Williams, is driven by a desire to solve a mystery. Two mysteries, really. One, the kind of mystery of his brooding employer's melancholy, and the other mystery is a decades-old murder. This investigation leads for him to disastrous consequences. Many of the mysteries in early Gothic texts are examples of the supernatural explained, in which a supernatural or a seemingly supernatural incident is found to have a natural solution. So in their investigations, heroines succeed in exorcising the ghosts by identifying them as natural, not supernatural beings, and in so doing expose a criminal conspiracy, as Carpenter notes. For example, in Anne Radcliffe's Mysteries of Udolpho, 1794, the ghosts haunting the ruined wing of the Chateau Leblanc are actually a group of pirates in sheets. So the central device of footstep, i.e. the supernatural as cover for criminal activity, has a very long Gothic history. This interest in crime continued in the 19th century's development and evolution of the Gothic into a range of different genres, including the Newgate fiction of authors like William Harrison Ainsworth, the sensation fiction of Wilkie Collins or Mary Elizabeth Braddon, the Gothic crime of writers like Edgar Allan Poe or Arthur Conan Doyle, and even the occult detective of writers like Algernon Blackwood and Dion Fortune. As Spooner notes, crime and Gothic fiction are not clearly distinguished in the 19th century, with traces of Gothic in most crime narratives and crimes in most Gothic novels. The nature of the interrelation between Gothic and crime fiction, however, has been debated. So Michelle Miranda argues that the Victorian Gothic crime fiction directly correlated to advancements in criminal investigation and forensic science, with rationalist advancements forming a barrier against darkness, evil, and degeneration. In contrast, for Niels Clausen, this fiction is not rooted in an optimistic 19th century scientism, but rather in the idea of fin de siècle decadence and degeneration, which escapes the attempted confines of a rational solution. So this paper today, it's not aiming to decide between these two readings of the Victorian Gothic, but rather to point to the shared emphasis on, in the words of Ascari, a tension between Gothic elements and modernity, which reveals an oppositional concept of reason and degeneration, and an implicit fear of and fascination with the transgression of these boundaries. As Clausen argues, Victorian Gothic crime is usually focused on a haunting or imprisoning past, the fear of regression, discovering the dark, repressed side of oneself, and narratives of violence in claustrophobic, urban, or alienating, isolated landscapes. However, I'm not arguing that Hare is the direct descendant of this Victorian iteration. Rather, she looks back to the early Gothic. Hare's romances, as we know, are predominantly set in the Georgian and Regency periods, on which she conducted extensive research, and her work is littered with references to writers and texts of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, including Gothic authors like Matthew Lewis, who she refers to as Monk Lewis, Anne Radcliffe, and Charlotte Smith. At one point she misreferences, but let that slide, pointing to her familiarity with the form. By suggesting that her work is influenced by this earlier Gothic, I'm not trying to argue that the tropes, aesthetics, and incidents I outline had no place in Victorian writing. After all, there is a close familial and evolutionary relationship between these Gothic periods. However, I argue that Hare emphasises particular tropes and uses strategies that were central to the early period, focusing on themes of deception, the instability of the mundane world, and virtue rather than reason triumphant. So instead of the juxtaposed principles of reason and degeneration, we have virtue and evil being played out. There isn't a simple linear progression from the 18th century Gothic to the modern detective novel. Instead, as this talk hopes to show, 20th century writers like Hare were able to draw on the Gothic of multiple periods, adapting strategies, techniques, and elements from different epochs in a range of innovative and inventive ways. So to begin our discussion of Footsteps in the Dark and the Gothic, it's necessary to demonstrate the Gothic credentials of the novel by identifying some early Gothic tropes and aesthetics that it adopts. This is not an attempt to create a checklist of Gothic features, thereby falling into the common trap of presenting popular genres' interactions with the Gothic mode as derivative, formulaic, and repetitious, something that you'll find in a lot of criticism of popular genres like the romance or the detective. Rather, it's an attempt to show Hare's knowing development of Gothic features, allowing for a discussion then of their focus and the purpose of their use. So first, the Gothicization of place and space is central to the novel. Inquisitional spaces are evoked several times, such as the cell in which Peter and Margaret are held, which is described as a square cave cut out of solid stone, all except the door made of thick wood. This connection to the inquisitional imagery is made explicit in the quote that you can see on screen, in Margaret's description of the monk as resembling one of those inquisitional people. These references relate back to the early Gothic, of course, and early Gothic's depiction of a threatening and monstrous Catholicism and its frequent focus on inquisitional scenes of torture and imprisonment in works like Matthew Lewis's The Monk from 1796 or Charles Maturin's Melmoth the Wanderer from 1820. The text, by which I mean Footsteps in the Dark, more broadly relies on a range of Gothic mise en scène, focusing on aesthetics of antiquity, claustrophobia, and entrapment, which evoke Chris Baldick's definition of the Gothic as relying on a fearful sense of inheritance in time with a claustrophobic sense of enclosure in space. The Priory's cellars, for example, lead to a series of secret and labyrinthine passages connected to a ruined chapel and a local inn at the centre of the forging conspiracy. The cellars are described thus. The place felt dank and very cold. Grey walls of stone flanked the passage. The roof was of stone also and vaulted. Charles moved forward down the arched corridor in the direction of the library. Various cellars led out of the main passage. In the first was a great mound of coal, but the rest were empty. So the cellars are described as dank and very cold, made of stone, vaulted, with various cellars leading out of the main passage. They are, in Charles' own words, something of a labyrinth, and he exclaims at one point, "What a maze this place is." So this combined emphasis on hidden entrances leading into and from the cellar, interlocking passageways that confound the explorer, the notable antiquity of the space compared to the modernity of its inhabitants, and the oppressive dank atmosphere, refers us back to the tropes and aesthetics of the early Gothic. It elicits images of the labyrinthine passages through which our heroines alternately escape and are entrapped in novels like Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto, from 1764, the first Gothic novel, or Radcliffe's A Sicilian Romance from 1790. As in Lewis's The Monk, these passages in Footsteps inevitably lead us towards charnel vaults, filled with, as this description says, grim relics, like the worm-eaten coffins and bones crumbling to dust. This charnel vault space is the space in which the monk, or the guy disguised as a monk, is finally discovered in Footsteps, and it's echoing, either deliberately or otherwise, Ambrosio's capture in the vaults in which he's killed his sister in Matthew Lewis's novel, The Monk. We begin to see intersections of Gothic parody and excess in the novel's depiction of the house, which emphasises its sprawling confusion and hybrid nature, much like you'll find in quite a lot of the houses that are described in Georgette. But this one has a little bit more terror as seasoning. So we're told that it was, quote, built originally many hundreds of years before of grey stone. Much of it was now ruined, and much had been added at different periods, so that the present house was a rambling structure, set in wooded grounds where oaks reared up huge gnarled trunks from out of a tangle of undergrowth. The house is also riddled with secret passageways and hidden cupboards and entrances. It also, as we see in this quote, has its own ruin in the grounds. A chapel, which was dismantled during the Reformation and later battered by Cromwell's cannon. Not much of it now remained, but fragments of the walls rose up crumbling out of the grass. So this sort of ruin imagery evokes not only the early Gothic's preoccupation with the ruin, found in texts like Radcliffe's Romance of the Forest, 1791, in which the heroine and her adopted family take refuge in a ruined abbey. It also invokes the contemporary late 18th century ruin discourse, which re-evaluated the Civil War and the Reformation in relation to the ruin-pocked landscape of Great Britain. The house and its grounds, therefore, are an informed Gothic cliché. I'd also add, since my stay at Newstead, where I now work, that there's quite clearly a link here to Newstead, I would argue, which is Byron's ancestral home, which is a ruined priory, which also has a legend of a monk attached to it. The closest town in this novel is Manfield, and the closest town to Newstead is Mansfield. So I think there's probably some deliberate echoing there as well. So another important feature adopted from the early Gothic is, of course, the explained supernatural, most obvious in the figure of the false spectral monk, who is really, of course, Colonel Ackley, the leader of the gang of forgers. One sec, guys. As Ascari notes, false apparitions played a large role in sensation and detective fiction of the 19th century, and Carpenter suggests that therefore by this time, rumours of hauntings appear to be little more than vestiges of a generic legacy. I would like to sort of challenge that a little bit in relation to this novel, at least. Hare is certainly self-consciously employing a familiar trope, so familiar, indeed, that her protagonist's suspicions are aroused by their recognition of it. However, the text's repeated use of the explained supernatural, again and again and again, suggests a broader purpose than simply a self-conscious generic callback. So another example might prove illuminating. So let's have a look at the seance where a knocking occurs. It's almost immediately revealed that this knocking is actually Constable Flinders, who is rapping on the window. This is the kind of comic relief local Bobby. So it's him knocking at the window, and the scene soon descends into farce. It's a pathetic revelation with a B, meaning a sort of a comic revelation that releases tension. And it leads us to question, perhaps, whether the deployment of the supernatural explained is chiefly comic. with its use being an early example of Hare's signature comic Gothic, found in her later romance works like The Reluctant Widow or The Quiet Gentleman, which I've talked about in a previous talk on the YouTube channel. If you're watching this on the YouTube, go look for it. Anyway, the comic Gothic, however, is rarely simply just a question of laughter. So, throughout Footsteps, Hare engages in a form of the Gothic that I've defined elsewhere as the Austinian Gothic, a term referencing Austen's Gothic parody Northanger Abbey. So this form mixes parody, often through the tool of pathetic revelation, and the authentically Gothic. Footsteps, as an Austinian Gothic, is a novel whose parodic hyperbole encodes the legitimate threats of a mundanely Gothic extra-fictional world. Like Northanger Abbey, it functions as a Gothic parody, not simply burlesquing the Gothic tradition, but extracting its core of truth. Northanger Abbey's Catherine may be led astray by her Gothic lens, overreading situations and convincing herself, for example, that General Tilney murdered or imprisoned his wife. However, this Gothic overreading allows her to see the truth behind Tilney's impeccable social facade. By the end of the novel, we're not left with Henry's dismissive renunciation of Catherine's theorising. We're like, that couldn't possibly happen in today's day and age. Instead, along with Catherine, we have, quote, heard enough to feel that in suspecting General Tilney of either murdering or shutting up his wife, she had scarcely sinned against his character or magnified his cruelty. End quote. So the protagonists of the Austinian Gothic learn that the visions of romance do not match reality, but they may lead us to an awareness of dangers less obvious, but all the more sinister for that. So similarly in Footsteps, Gothic perceptions such as Celia's overwrought emotional reaction to every supposedly supernatural incident are mocked, and the Gothic successes are ridiculed, but a Gothic threat is also revealed. Footsteps' dark underbelly is a world of false appearances, murderous greed, addiction, despair, and threat, and it's all too close to the surface and is conversely revealed by the parodic Gothic tropes of the text. So let's have a look at two examples of this. The seance, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail, and then Aunt Bosanquette's encounter with the monk in the library. So, Aunt Bosanquette calls a seance after a skull rolls seemingly inexplicably down the stairs, revealing a skeleton in a priest hole, and after she sees the monk herself. Having previously been skeptical, she becomes a believer and organizes a seance, supposing that the ghost has been endeavouring to attract our notice and probably wants something. So the seance itself is a mix of farce and terror, with Charles falling asleep, Peter and Charles mocking the idea, and of course the interruption from Constable Flinders. However, we're told that after a long period of silence, the board moved quite an inch across the paper underneath it. Once it started, the board seemed to grow quite energetic, and began to describe circles and make jerky darts in every direction. So there's this kind of growing fear here, and this is never quite dissolved, even by the pathetic revelation, because this isn't a proper example of the supernatural explained, because these movements of the planchette are never explained away. The other sort of aspect that is truly Gothic is revealed later on, when we kind of confront the villain of the piece, Colonel Ackley. We think no more about it until we meet him again, and he admits that I was amused at your efforts to conjure up my wraith, madam, he said. I was behind the panel at the time, and really, I was almost tempted to appear. I always hate to disoblige the ladies. So far more terrifying than a ghost, there's a murderer hiding in the walls. The family had previously been warned by the French artist Duval that you will never see his face, but you will go away from that house, which is his. That house where he goes glissant up and down the stairs, though you do not see, where he watches you, though you do not know. Yes, you will go. So there's a terrifying sense of spectral presence here, made more horrific by its fleshly reality. Various members of the party have experienced the feeling of being watched, and this paranoia has been dismissed as hysterical, but it's revealed to be true, evoking the Gothic claustrophobic myth of absolute surveillance, as Ascari defines it. This seemingly parodic Gothic house is revealed to be an authentically Gothic setting, more than the sum of its cliches, an uncanny, permeable, vulnerable, entrapping space. So if the final revelations about the seance force us to confront the Gothic threat in and of the house, the library visitation of the monk causes a reassessment of the monk. Having descended for a biscuit and a book, my favourite character, Anta Bosanquet, spends time in the library, looking for a book, basically. After hearing a slight noise, she freezes before convincing herself that it's nonsense and turning to face the sound. Through close focalization, i.e., although it's in the third person, we're restricted to her perspective, we experience Aunt Bosanquet's disorientation and her concerted attempts to convince herself that nothing is wrong. And then she raises her candle and sees something. The dark shape grew distinct in the tiny light. A cowled figure was standing motionless by the fireplace, and through the slits in the cowl, two glittering eyes were fixed upon Mrs. Bosanquet. She stood as though paralyzed, and even as she stared at it, the figure moved, glided towards her with one menacing hand stretched out like the talon of a bird of prey. It's a terrifying image, and it's a horrifying revelation. Mrs. Bosanquet interprets this figure as a ghost, leading to the disbelief and the ridicule of the male members of the party. However, the truth is more frightening. All the while, when she was vulnerable and alone, a murderer had stood in the shadows and watched, advancing upon her when discovered, reaching out a hand in violence. So the monk might not be the supernatural figure that Mrs. Bosanquet supposes, but the terror of the scene is not counterfeit. It relies on the Gothic's ability to uncover reality as it obscures it. The man dressed as a monster is more monstrous than any supernatural creature could ever be. Mrs. Bosanquet's reaction to this is to faint, and this could be seen as an act of excess. It's decried as one by several members of the family, and she herself describes it as unseemly. It's also simultaneously parodic and Gothic. So it can be read as an excessive act of misinterpretation, a surrender to supernatural fears mocked both by the text and the character herself. However, as Sanchez Santos and Aguirre note, both parody and the Gothic function by using the presence of the extreme and the hyperbolical, with seemingly parodic techniques simultaneously partaking in the intensity, hyperbole, and excess of the Gothic. So while her fainting is an act of misinterpretation, it's also a fitting response to the far more terrifying threat that's actually present. So as this passage suggests, Hare also engages with the Gothic through a range of narrative techniques aimed at evoking authentic terror and horror. This is an extension on the lighter Austinian Gothic of texts like Northanger Abbey into a realm of terror which extends beyond the protagonist to the reader. So let's have a look at a slightly longer example which demonstrates Hare's techniques. I put it on the screen, but I'll also be reading it out. So in the terror of finding herself a prisoner. So at this point, Margaret has discovered the secret door. She's gone in, she's seen it's a staircase, she's stepped forward, and the door is shut behind her, locking her in the dark. So in the terror of finding herself a prisoner, Margaret lost her head, shrieked for her brother, beating wildly on the back of the panel, trying to tear it open. She only succeeded in breaking a fingernail, and her panic grew. She screamed, "Help! Help! Peter! Peter! Peter!" Somewhere below her, she heard a soft, padding step, and the hush of a robe brushing against the wall. Like a mad woman, she clawed at the panel. "Quick! Oh, quick, Peter! Help!" Then in the darkness, a gloved hand stole across her mouth, and an arm in a wide sleeve was round her, holding her in a vice. She tried to break free, to jerk her head away, but her arms were clamped to her sides and that horrible gloved hand was like a gag over her mouth. She felt herself slipping into unconsciousness, and through the sudden roaring in her ears she heard, although from a great distance, Peter's voice calling, "Margaret, what is it? Where are you?" A low, inhuman chuckle sounded immediately above her head, and there was something so gloating and fiendish in that soft sound that terror such as she had never known seized her. Then the waves met over her head, and she fainted. So a variety of Gothic strategies are deployed here. Firstly, There's the narrowing of the narrative point of view, focalizing through Margaret's perspective, immersing the reader in her immediate experience. We're stuck with her in this enclosed space. There's also an emphasis on darkness, on obscurity, and restricted sensory input, which is familiar from the focalization techniques in early Gothic texts, like Radcliffe's The Italian, in which Vivaldi goes on a desperate journey through the halls of the Inquisition, unable to truly see anything and just hearing the cries of distress around him. This emphasis on darkness is consistent with the techniques of terror deployed by the early Gothic. Anne Radcliffe, in her Supernatural in Poetry, defined the difference between terror and horror, giving the preference to terror as it awakens the faculties to a high degree of life, compared to horror, which contracts, freezes, and nearly annihilates them. The terror, she argues, is largely based on a lack of concrete information, arguing that only those of, quote, cold imaginations find certainty is more terrible than surmise. So terror is frequently dependent on audial cues, so audial horror, such as the unsourced cries of pain in Sicilian Romance. In Footsteps, we have the hush of a robe brushing against the wall, the footsteps up the stairs, and the low, inhuman chuckle, whose source is unknown and therefore more terrifying. There is also an emphasis, of course, on restriction and helplessness, as she is held in a vice and gagged, restricting not only movement but speech. This lack of agency is redirected then onto the reader, who is turned into an unwilling witness incapable of intervening. A final Gothic technique is found in the emphasis on extreme emotion made tangible to readers through its embodiment. So this concept comes from the work of Sanchez Santos and Aguirre again. The depiction of Margaret's fear is embodied in uncontrolled movement, and the horrific image of the nail ripping off on the wall relies on a vocabulary of terror almost identical to that found in early Gothic scenes, such as the entrapped lovers and their despair in Melmoth. They're locked in together with no way out, and in the end they sort of start eating each other, actually. Happily, Margaret and Peter don't eat each other in this text. The most familiar embodiment of Gothic extreme emotion, the swoon, ends this scene for both protagonist and reader, leaving its ending unclear and its tensions unresolved. A true sort of Gothic terror is evoked. And this scene that I've just described contrasts sharply with the earlier hilarity of the siblings' argument about who will pay a courtesy visit to the chatty parson's wife, who will stay behind, and then the discussion about romance and various other things that Margaret and Peter have while they're left home alone. The combination of Gothic narrative style interspersed with parodic elements, with farce, with biting wit, is the key to the Gothic project of Footsteps. It is what differentiates it from the lighter parodic styling of Northanger Abbey, or the purely comic Gothic of works like Arthur Conan Doyle's Selecting a Ghost, The Ghosts of Goresthorpe Grange from 1883. In Goresthorpe Grange, there is a fake ghost that's used to commit a crime, but it functions as much as a social satire of the socially climbing protagonist who's eager to source a ghost for his newly acquired country house. It serves as much to sort of highlight that social satire as it does to unveil the villainy of the supposed purveyor of spirits. Footsteps, however, moves much further into the realm of terror. Footsteps' mix of comedy and real terror represents a different mode, more akin to the comedic and terrific excess of The Monk by Matthew Lewis, but without the gleeful emphasis on transgression. Footsteps, unlike The Monk, deplores its Gothic world rather than presenting it as a fantastic spectacle. So while Footsteps is often dismissed as a juvenile effort, its tonal juxtaposition is not simply the infelicitous result of a poorly controlled narrative tone. Indeed, the frequent jumps in tone reflect and reiterate the central discovery of the tale, the reality of living in a world whose dangers lurk beneath the surface of a reassuring modernity. The threats which haunt the text are embodied in the narrative. We are always one step away from slipping into horror, but neither horror nor humour are more real. Instead, they're in a constant, uneasy tension. It's not simply a case of revealing an underlying reality here. It's the constant and recurring recognition that both fear and laughter have equal place in the worlds of both text and reader. Just as Golden Age detective fiction more broadly can be seen as a response in Rowland's words to a post-World War I traumatized landscape, Hare's technique can be seen as a reflection of the horrifying duality revealed by the mechanized slaughter of the First World War. Humans' capacity for inhumanity on a mass scale is being revealed again now. So far from and simultaneously close to the safe and ordered world of ordinary life. Ordinary life there in inverted commas. Footsteps carries with it the brittle confidence of the 20s, both informed by and occluding the horrors of the war, and which, when Hare is writing in 1932, is haunted by the ephemerality of security and plenty which is represented by the Great Depression. Hare's choice of a villain with military rank, a colonel, and a criminal operation focused on economic manipulation hint at the wider context to which the novel is responding. The double nature of reality is also reflected in the uneasy fluidity and doubleness of language in the novel. A conversation between Peter and Charles, then Wilkes the landlord and Ackley the evil colonel/monk, showcases this treacherous instability. Peter and Charles are in the pub discussing their recent experiences with the French artist Duval, who is, spoiler alert, the engraver who works for this forging group. Overhearing their conversation, Wilkes inquires, well, what's he been up to, I should like to know. Intriguing us by his conversation, Charles responds, making our blood run cold by his sinister references to our monk. The colonel, Ackley, later joins the conversation, saying, is he drunk again? And then, before announcing that something will have to be done about it if that's so, you never know with these drug fiends, he may turn dangerous. Wilkes replies in the affirmative, yes, sir, that's what I've been thinking. This appears, certainly to Peter and Charles, and probably to the reader, to be an innocuous conversation, referring to the potential danger posed by Duval's erratic behaviour and drug use. However, reread through the knowledge that Ackley and Wilkes are the ruthless gang leaders for whom Duval is working, the conversation takes on a very different complexion. Wilkes, I should like to know, at the beginning is revealed not to be simply a colloquial phrase greasing conversation, but rather a literal and threatening interest in the information. The colonel's declaration that something will have to be done becomes performative rather than descriptive, instigating the doing to which the statement refers. While Peter and Charles understand the danger posed by Duval to refer to a physical threat, the threat of violence or uncontrolled behaviour due to his drug use, Wilkes and Ackley are talking in a different register. They're referring to the threat posed to their operation by his loose lips and wagging tongue. Wilkes' final affirmative, yes sir, that's what I've been thinking, writes Duval's death warrant. Unknown to Peter and Charles, they have been partaking in a conversation which has condemned a man to a brutal death. Language, far from a tool of clarification, has become one of obfuscation. Meanings have become unstable, and language has become duplicitous and dangerous, incapable of containing, rationalizing, or eradicating the threats they face. The threats of the novel are presented using Gothic strategies which rely in part on both intertextuality and metatextuality. So intertextuality is, broadly speaking, reference to existing texts and tropes, etc. Metatextuality is a sense of the text's own fictionality. So it's references which make it clear that we are part of a fictional text, which force us out of the fictional world to some extent. So the clearest example of this is the breaking the fourth wall, somebody turning to camera and starting to talk to you in a film. But it can also be references to, for example, this is just like a novel, which makes you aware of the fictionality of the text. So anyway, this reliance on intertextuality first is not, of course, unique to Footsteps in crime fiction. Indeed, Rowland says that the first and most significant characteristic of Golden Age fiction is its self-referential and then also metafictional quality. The Gothic similarly relies on intertextuality in the form of what Sanchez Santos and Aguirre label formulaicity, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but the Gothic, they argue, uses strong forms, i.e. sort of tropes, etc., which easily lend themselves to a codification in terms of conventions or rules of composition. They're constraints authors take upon themselves when they choose to write a Gothic work. However, this formulaicity isn't a repetitive formula. Instead, we should see it as devices of resistance against the centre's demand for originality, uniqueness, or innovation, In other words, this isn't just kind of a rote copying. Instead, it's a much more engaged relationship with existing texts, tropes, aesthetics, etc., which resists the sort of another mode of literary writing, which focuses on originality, on creating something completely new. What genre fiction tends to do more broadly is it acknowledges that this originality is not possible and instead looks towards the complexity that's possible within intertextuality. So rather than an emphasis on originality, the Gothic recognizes the complexity offered by intertextual engagement, emphasizing both iteration and variation, i.e. repetition and difference, in which a Gothic motif or character accumulates connotations in its appearance across novels, enabling complex intertextual dialogues. Attentions to the text's varied use of intertextual strategies, including direct quotation, use of reference to tropes, iteration of motifs, narrative strategies and characterization, echoing of specific works, or mentions of particular authors, is vital to an understanding of both the Gothic techniques of the text and the richness of this intertextual engagement. Hare's use of intertextuality has been previously explored in relation to her romance fiction by Elizabeth Barr and Lisa Hopkins. Both argue that Hare's, quote, complex and creative use of other authors and their traditions allows for different levels of engagement with the text, that's from Barr, with prior knowledge of referenced material opening a second layer of meaning. So an example of this in this text, in Footsteps, is Charles' betrayed cry of "Et tu, Brute," when Aunt Bosanquette starts to entertain the possibility of the supernatural. So this is obviously a reference to Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, and it's a phrase which has entered common usage as a declaration of betrayal, often comedic. However, for the knowledgeable reader, another connection is also suggested. Brutus's famous encounter with the, quote, monstrous apparition of Caesar in Shakespeare's play, and historical accounts. For the discerning reader, this quotation then foreshadows Mrs. Bosanquette's own meeting with the monstrous apparition of the monk, for she is the first to encounter him. The function of intertextuality in the novel here is about adding layers of meaning for the informed reader, but it's also deployed in various other ways, performing multiple functions within the texts. So one of the functions is to reinforce Gothic terror by drawing parallels with existing Gothic antecedents. For example, the secret passageway which leads up into Mrs. Bosanquette's bedroom through her cupboard presents a clear parallel to the infamous second staircase in Emily's bedroom in The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. In that novel, Emily is unable to seal the staircase, and it remains a point of continuous threat, which her step-uncle Montoni leaves unaddressed as a way of emphasizing and reinforcing Emily's precarious and imperiled situation. Similarly, the secret passageway into Aunt Bosanquette's room, which goes all the way down to the vaults, the charnel vaults, reveals that the house is permeable and porous, liable to the incursions of an outside evil, and home to an invasive malice. The effect is reinforced by these intertextual echoes. So that's an example. I popped it on the screen as indirect intertextuality because it's not a direct reference. Intertextuality and metatextuality are also key to the Austinian Gothic parody, of course, in the simultaneously misleading and revealing lens that they provide for protagonists. So Celia fulfills the role of a classic Gothic parody heroine all the time, overreading all the potentially supernatural signs in the house through a lens provided by Gothic and supernatural fiction. Her uneasy feelings about the house, however, and her repeated requests to leave are the most in tune with the threat the house presents. The character's intertextual awareness and genre competence can help them discover these potential threats, but also can lead them into danger, or mislead them into danger. Charles and Peter, in meeting Wilkes, which is the landlord, perceive a landlord of such comfortable proportions and such benevolent mien that he might well have stepped from the pages of a Dickens. This comparison, rather than revealing a Gothic reality, hides it. Similarly, while their awareness of the trope of the criminal enterprise disguised as a haunting, means they correctly interpret the central mystery, they are yet, quote, misled by generic expectations. They're incapable of identifying the colonel as the arch-forger. I'm quoting myself there. Instead of the upright and amusing colonel, who is the actual villain, they suspect the mysterious stranger, cunningly called Stranger, and the foreign other, Duval. Even Margaret suspects her lover strange, or would-be lover strange, saying, was he a crook? One of the master crooks of fiction who had such address and charm that no one ever suspected him? So this reference by Margaret is one of many in the text which demonstrates a level of metafictional awareness. It's a specifically fictional reference here. The novel foregrounds its fictionality multiple times through the character's habit of overtly reading their situation through a fictional lens, such as this example from Margaret, and referring to Bowers the butler as the mysterious butler of fiction, and referring to Peter as a failed hero in a popular thriller. The characters directly refer to the paradigms, using them to interpret and act upon their situation, sometimes successfully, but sometimes with disastrous consequences. So Kim Sherwood points to the idea that Hare's frequent use of metatextual techniques, i.e. pointing to the fictionality of the text, that she argues that she uses these references and comparisons to the fictional to construct the illusion of her fictional world, and then lay the illusion bare, engaging with the battle between romance and reality. So I think this is a slightly simplified understanding of what metatextuality does, because it's not simply that you say, oh, that's what fiction would be, but this is what's real, because you're still in a fictional world. So you're saying, this is what fiction is, but I'm also fictional, and then it gets a little bit Hall of Mirrors-esque. This is certainly what happens in Footsteps. So the metatextual in Footsteps doesn't solidify a comfortable sense of reality. Rather, it leads to disorientation and misinterpretation. Fictional characters compare themselves to the tropes of fiction, bringing us no closer to the real, but instead immersing us in an echoing hall of mirrors of unreality. Reading Footsteps doesn't lead reader or protagonist to an easy distinction between fiction and reality. Instead, it forces a confrontation with ever more intricate revelations of both the transparency and the opacity of fiction, its ability to both mirror and distort. Perhaps most disturbingly, in Footsteps, we see the character's awareness of the fictional become not only a lens of interpretation, but we see it taking on a life of its own. There we go. Mrs. Bosanquet at the beginning of the novel makes an offhand comment about the potential for hauntings in the house. I dare say there's no such thing, my dear, but I always remember reading a most unpleasant story about someone who was walled up in a monastery or a convent. I forget which, but it was something to do with monks, I know. The colonel, hidden in the walls, as he seems to be all the time, overhears this comment, and he then places a skeleton in a priest's hole in order to be discovered. Celia and Mrs. Bosanquet are, quote, prepared by their previous Gothic knowledge to believe the event, quote from me there, with Celia declaring that it is now clear that, quote, its unquiet spirit was obviously haunting the scene of its ghastly end. The colonel has made fiction reality to sow panic and confusion, and in doing so blurs the lines between the real and the unreal by making the distinction immaterial. This article, or this talk, so far has outlined how the Gothic mode is deployed to destabilize, to terrify, and to reveal. However, as Catherine Spooner notes, the Gothic can also be comic, romantic, celebratory, gleeful, whimsical, or even joyous. In Footsteps, this is clearest in the depiction of the comic endings, or the happy endings, and also in Hare's anti-Gothic heroines, which are a key part both of Hare's parodic engagement with the Gothic and her production of an alternative mode of Gothic heroine, or Gothic heroinism. 3 alternative models of heroinism are offered. So Celia performs the role of the traditional Gothic heroine of Radcliffe or Parsons. She's highly susceptible to exaggerated emotions, credulous of the supernatural. She lacks the curiosity of the early Gothic heroine, but retains recognizable elements or parallels of the sensibility of the early of these figures. This is the Gothic heroine that's most clearly parodied in the text. Margaret fulfills a role similar to the girl detective that Carpenter argues developed from the early Gothic heroines and their insatiable curiosity. Margaret is largely skeptical, curious, intrepid, and at the centre of the novel's love story. And although she is more or less successful in terms of the mystery ends up being solved, she ends up marrying the man that she wants, neither her nor Celia survive the novel unscathed. Margaret's daring do leads her into the monk's trap, so she ends up locked in an underground cell awaiting death. Celia's exaggerated emotional responses, on the other hand, leave her completely unable to deal with any situation arising in the narrative, from rolling skulls to missing sisters. All she can really do is stand there and panic. In Aunt Bosanquette, we find a different model of heroinism and an early model of Hare's anti-Gothic heroine, which I've described in my other work. I can send you the chapters where I talk about it if you like. The anti-Gothic heroine found in characters like Mary Challoner in Devil's Cub from 1932 and Drusilla Standen in The Quiet Gentleman. She is, quote, not at all imaginative, and her actions are based consistently on a set of logical, if sometimes erroneous, premises. When the skeleton is discovered, her first act is to disinfect the cupboard. Undistracted by the supernatural, she focuses on the far more real threat of contamination from human remains. On seeing the monk, she reacts emotionally, as we've already seen, but she condemns the response as useless, referring to her weakness in screaming in that uncontrolled manner. She says then that, I realise now that my proper course would have been to have challenged the apparition and commanded it to tell me what it wanted. From thinking it over, I'm convinced it manifested itself for some good purpose. Thank you, Peter. Yes, I will have an egg. She began to tap the shell briskly. It is obviously an unquiet spirit, and when you consider that it no doubt belongs to the remains you discovered in that very nasty, airless little cupboard, one can hardly wonder at it. So here, even in the act of starting to accept the supernatural, she approaches it logically and with an active plan. She's also linked intrinsically to the mundane. I love the fact that she's just chatting about eggs in the middle of this passage. It's also notable that she doesn't allow her emotional response to raise doubts as to the veracity of her experience. She rejects the dismissive attempts of her family to explain it away as fancy, instead using her response of fainting and screaming as evidence of the situation's reality, of her actual sighting of the monk, saying, well, do you suppose I would scream for help merely because I thought I saw someone? I did see it, as plainly as I see you. As a result of this sighting, as we can see, she decides to investigate its presence through supernatural means. These scenes lead to farce in the seance and cause her to become the butt of Charles and Peter's jokes. But her logic and reasoning have remained consistent. Her opinion is changed by evidence and experience with an emphasis on a practical, if somewhat esoteric solution. So while at times a comic figure, she remains unharmed throughout the novel, is the first to take sensible steps such as calling the police, and is active in investigation, in a limited way. She never throws herself into danger like Margaret. If she's not the fully developed anti-Gothic heroine of Hare's later novels, she's certainly their prototype, offering a different model of Gothic femininity, as, quote, understated, rational, intelligent, and ultimately prosaic heroine required to survive, the one that is required to survive a Gothic world of murder, betrayal, and persecution. In this text, the Gothic heroine becomes a key parodic target, whether in the form of Celia's excesses or in the depiction of an anti-Gothic heroine, one who enacts the role of the Gothic heroine while steadfastly refusing the type. But the Gothic heroine offers us a sort of positive ending, a juxtaposition to the Gothic terrors that have inhabited the text, because it offers us a way forward. Hare's engagement with the Gothic is multivalent. The novel functions as both a comic and a disquieting variant of the Austinian Gothic, engaging in Gothic parody to reveal an underlying Gothic world. Rather than presenting a direct evolution from the Gothic crime fiction of the Victorian period, it reproduces early Gothic tropes, conventions, and aesthetics, which create an intertextual dialogue with the early Gothic. The novel deploys and dismantles Gothic expectations of the ghostly and macabre, only to reveal the terror of a far more mundane human evil. It uses humour to ridicule the excessive Gothic tropes and create a destabilising awareness of the fragility of the daytime world the characters and readers think they live in. The emphasis on unstable and doubled perception extends to the very language of the text, making the novel not only Gothic in content but in form, allowing the Gothic implications of the text to seep into the extra-fictional world. The novel relies on intertextual references and metatextual awareness to provide the interpretive frameworks through which the characters and readers engage with the Gothic world of the text. These strategies unveil, conceal, and create the Gothic world of the novel, with the foregrounded fictionality of the text creating an unsettling mirror effect which causes the Gothic excess of the novel to escape the bounds of the page, inflicting the reader's own surety of the relation of the fictional and the real, fantasy and romance, reason and irrationality. However, Hare leaves us not with despondence, but with optimism, mapping ways to survive the unsettling Gothic world in the virtuous, if misguided, actions of her protagonists and the anti-Gothic heroism of Aunt Bosanquette. The comic Gothic of Hare's Footsteps forces us to engage with the Gothic not simply as a list of tropes, aesthetics, or techniques, but as a form with varied expressions, complexly engaged in an intertextual dialogue, stretching back to an 18th century tradition not only of stylistic features, but of thematic concerns, effective strategies, and textually embodied confrontations with the transgressive, the unsettling, and the dark. Footsteps also allows for a re-evaluation of the comic Gothic and crime fiction, moving us towards an understanding of the complex relations of Gothic comedy and Gothic terror. In Hare's novel, Gothic terror and Gothic comedy are symbiotic forms, neither erasing nor overriding the other, instead creating a truly Gothic world in which both a smile and a scream are only a second away. Thanks for listening, guys. A little bit of a biography here. I'll pop that up for you later, and that's me done. I'm going to stop recording. Thanks for listening.